on finite state automata theory. So it fit in with the sort of digital computer metaphor of the time, and the idea that you could do anything you wanted with a sufficiently specified deterministic automaton operating on symbols and rules. And as a result, they completely got lost from connection with with the material world, with the biological paradigm, with real brains that were the sort of nurturing soil of cybernetics. And we're still digging ourselves out from the gigantic hole that symbolic AI and that whole metaphor has wrought. And there's a lot of recovery that we still need to do to get back to the place where we were in the early 60s when those ideas and that rooting and that grounding in biology and psychology and neuroscience was present.
I just want to challenge the idea that we actually dug ourselves out, because the the funding in Europe for this massive European project about modelling the brain seems to me to be another manifestation of the...
Well, yeah, it's got its problems, but actually that's a healthy development vis-a-vis symbolic AI, where there's not even the pretense of trying to understand how brains work. You can say that it's misguided, but at least people are then thinking about distributed networks and connection with the material world and perception and action and all that stuff.
So it's misguided but not tied to symbolic AI, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
As some of you will know, the Cybernetics of Cybernetics had a grant, sort of the last grant of the BCL. I don't know, virtually the last grant, but it got a grant from Stuart Brand's Point Foundation, which was set up to distribute the profits from the mass publication of the last Whole Earth catalog. So it's kind of wonderful. It was anything but military funding that allowed the production values of Cybernetics to be as robust as they were. Okay, all right, thanks. Tori, if you'll let people know where you're coming from, I'll get you things going.
I'm director of the Dactyl Foundation in New York City. It's Arts Foundation. We do a lot of collaboration with scientists. I started out in my graduate work studying narrative theories, and I was interested in teleology, which is very important to narrative theory. I was interested in self-organizing patterns in literature. And I ended up doing my dissertation work at the Santa Fe Institute, studying self-organization and also neutral evolutionary theory. After that, I went to a new field called Biosemiotics that some of you may be familiar with at Santa Fe Institute. The question of meaning kept coming up, and so I went to study semiotics to try to understand that. And now with Bruno's encouragement, I've been studying cybernetics, and I find that the things that I'm doing are the questions that I'm investigating were those that were investigated by in cybernetics. It's not clear to me how Varela and Metrono's self-referentially enclosed systems are capable of creative behavior. And it's not clear to me how they learn. I'm not satisfied. I was going to make that's I'm not satisfied with the argument that systems can learn by switching from self-reference to other reference. This is to assume that representations are like two-sided coins. If this isn't an example of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, I don't know what is. A better theory of creativity and learning is needed, and I think biosemiotics can help. Most people think of signs as dyadic constructions, with a signified and an arbitrary signifier that says little, if anything, about reality. biosemiotics uses a triadic model which grounds representation in teleological processes. For example, if an organism detects the sign of food and this triggers an appropriate response, that type of response is reinforced and will likely occur again. This feedback is part of what makes this a semiotic process, gives it meaning. The grounded triadic model that either works for an organism's continuation or it doesn't is thought to be a partial solution to the problem of radical constructivism. However, I found that biosemiotics needs to incorporate self-reference in its model explicitly, as I'm doing here. I'm working a bit differently than most biosemiotics, in order to make it work. If we can do this, it might be called second-order biosemiotics, or biosemiotics of biosemiotics. So, some background. Biosemiotics is a close cousin of cybernetics. It investigates animal and plant cell signaling. We can consider the physical structure of cells and their habits to be representative of their environments, not unlike mental representations. A cellular signaling response and a thought response are both habits. Cell signaling depends on chemical differences. Thoughts depend on differences of pattern interactions among and between neurons and neural groups. We assume thought patterns are more flexible than cell signaling, but they can still take habits. In his 1994 book, Jesper Hoffmeyer adapts Charles Sanders Peirce's semiotics to describe the activities of organisms without central nervous systems, which are not capable of mental representations, and yet still use semiosis, apparently. To make the argument stronger, I found it necessary to alter the Peircean sign, bringing it closer, I think, to the idea of representation in second-order cybernetics. The Peircean, if you're familiar, the vocabulary is a little bit different. Response there would be interpretant, sign there would be representimum, and object would be object, but those are operative. I think those are easier to use and easier certainly to use with biologists, which is important. In Peircean semiotics, the object of a sign, what it represents, is sometimes described as an actual physical object with material properties, and it's sometimes described as an ideal object. In this view of semiosis, an organism responds to the sign of an object that's not present. So it's different from mechanical causation. But when we are talking about the semiotic behavior of cells, we cannot speak of objects in this way. But the term object also means goal. And this helps us understand all semiosis as goal-directed behavior. You had a question?
Oh, no, I'm so sorry.
If anyone wants to interrupt me, you can, because I have a short presentation and I can go through one. So I don't mind stopping to clarify. In his sign triad, Peirce scholar Tom Short has purpose as a fourth element. He says he can see no other way around it and still make sense of Peirce's semiotics, which are famously triadic. He illustrates his formula by imagining that a deer flees, that's the response. At the noise, that's the sign of a potential predator, that's the object. In order to survive, that's the purpose. But if the object is not the predator but survival, then purpose is already integrated in the formula, and then we can just say deer flees, that's the response, at the noise of a potential predator in order to survive, where the object is now survival. So now we have our triad back. For biological systems without brains, the semiotic object, what the sign represents, must be understood as the objective of self-affirmation, of habits, and or self-preservation. This is in part why I'm using this circular model. It looks a bit different from the standard model, which is this. Every response to a sign as a sign is determined by past objectiveness, because the ability of the organism to respond in this way exists to the extent that it does because it's been selected for in the past. As Robert Rosen explained, living systems experience the past, experience the present, and anticipate the future by living in the past. So to repeat, a sign does not represent an object, but an objective. When it really does seem to be a sign, a thing, as when a wolf smells signs of a rabbit, I prefer to think of the rabbit as a means to an end, using again the teleological language. A wolf smells signs of a rabbit, he chases it, catches it, and eats it. Rabbits are only meaningful to wolves insofar as they are a means of survival, of self-maintenance. Thus, the odorant is not the sign of a particular rabbit with material properties. The odorant is a sign of survival or maintenance. The rabbit is a sign of the ultimate objective of survival. The sign triad, signs are usually made up of multiple sign triads. Signs inside the signs leaking back to each other. In a signaling cascade in a cell, we also think of the intermediate steps as a means to the end. If you have a molecule A and there's some sort of interaction and there's some sort of transformation and then you get a product B, that becomes a sign in the next process, a new response and a new transformation until the end, and then the whole process resets itself. The intermediate steps can be somewhat indeterminate and flexible as long as the goal is achieved at the end. Intermediate steps can be somewhat arbitrary, like the steps in a movable machine. Different organisms can use different chemical transformation sequences to achieve similar purposes. The arbitrariness of signs that ultimately lead to self-maintenance help convince us of the semiotic nature of these processes. Now, I want to take this generalized understanding of semiosis in biological systems, which has been limited, and apply it to human science. Here I'm walking on the beach, and I see footprints, and I think of feet. I'm not a predator, so I don't want to chase down the beachcombers and eat them. Nevertheless, my ultimate semiotic objective, similar to that of a predator, is self-affirmation. The footprint does not refer to the beachcomber's particular feet to me, the person who sees it. I may be misreading the sign. It may be some other sort of mark in the sand. But I've seen footprints before, and those experiences determine my response in this instance. The actual beachcombers do not determine my response. My idea of feet is part of my repertoire of knowledge, and as such, the perception of any sign of feet reconfirms one of my ideas about the world, which define my selfhood. Reading the sign of feet is then a self-referential and self-preserving. The ultimate objective of reading any sign is the effect that it tends to have. if I eventually come upon the beachcombers, my mental habit will be strengthened for this type of sign. If instead I come upon some sort of wind-powered contraption going on the beach, my mental habit for this type of sign will become more narrow and less robust. This is actually an artwork that is wind-powered. So this idea that the objective, the meaning of all semiosis is self-confirmation may seem to lead to radical constructivism. How does a semiotic organism get out of this self-confirming loop to learn something new about the external world? Well, a mental object can be about something that doesn't exist. The dinner that I think is around the corner based on signs I'm currently reading may not exist. I'm going to look at an example using bacteria. Suppose there exists some pseudo-glucose that would be poison to bacteria that need glucose to survive. The pseudo-glucose would have some similarity with glucose, such that the bacteria move toward it as if it were the sign of survival. The bacteria can only move mistakenly toward poison if semiotic objects are actually self-referential objectives, not material things. In this case, the bacteria's objective will turn out to be inexistent, but the semiotic response, as a semiotic response, still occurs. Let's say that we have some pseudo-glucose that is another form of sugar instead of poison. Then the bacteria might discover a new objective by mistake, and that's how novelty emerges. We can call this a creative interpretation. It's my belief that you have to start out with some idea, a wrong idea, in order to learn something. You can't start out empty with any notions whatsoever. You have to be convinced that you're going towards something, and only in that way can you make a mistake and learn. I think learning about something in the outside world often, maybe always, occurs in the way that artists have always said it does, by mistake and by chance similarity. So representation is not a two-sided coin. It's a complex triadic process. The meaning and effect of any sign is always self-confirmation of that type of habitual response to that sign. And when a mistaken reading of a sign leads to a different effect that is self-affirming in a novel way, learning occurs. That's it. This is my book on purposeful behavior and creativity as semiosis.
Questions? Comments? Bill?
There's an interesting book that I think you'd enjoy by Soren Breyer called Cybersemiotics. I don't know if you've seen it.
I know.
But it kind of
Yeah. We're in
conversation.
Same, yeah.
Yes. Please.
In cybernetics, we're also interested in variety and the number of varieties. Have you thought, or somebody thought, how many legitimate purposes, how many legitimate responses or behaviors that you can count and limit?
Because I'm classifying everything as some sort of self-affirmation or all.
Yeah. Well, how many senses of self-affirmation is there?
An infinite number?
It can't be possible. How can you affirm yourself in infinite numbers?
Every time a habit is more or less repeated, you are continuing the same type of behavior. And it's, there's a, I don't want to say the other side of the coin there. But I do have, in this book in particular, I make the point that that sort of continual habitual behavior becomes completely robotic at some point. And you don't really have true self-affirmation unless you change in order to stay the same, or change in a way that makes you more adaptive.
Well, Tori, I would just, what you're calling a two-sided coin, in some of the literature, there's a concept of a two-sided form. It's really following from Spencer Brown's. What's entailed by the mark of distinction is the connection between that which is distinguished and that which is not. So, in other words, your two-sided coin is a two-sided form, and the point is both sides are always come along for the rock. So the self-reference that you're grappling with as sort of the sort of mark of second-order cybernetic conceptuality, I think entails the other reference that is the other side of the coin, that is not the obverse. It's not excluded by one side being up. It's still there. So,
yes. That one side always implies the other. You can't have a one-sided coin. It's impossible. I think I haven't gotten rid of the two sides of the coin. I've sort of made it three-sided, and I've added the groundedness. Right. Because I still have, and I do kind of feel something with the two-sided coin. When molecules meet, they have these puzzle piece-like shapes, and in that sense, one can know the other by its opposite because they have these complementary shapes.
I was going to say, there are inherent problems in Persian semiotic, Persian triad. The notion that you're going to refer to something in an environment. Basically, although Peirce was the founder of pragmatism, his triad basically is a referentialist, sort of realist construction. And what you're trying to do is get out of that, because it's completely incompatible with radical constructivism, which is a epistemological and operationalist view, where you don't know what's outside your senses on the other side on the distal side of your sensory apparatus or measuring devices. You're trying to include goals now, purposes into your framework, and it's no longer really the Peircean triad. I would say look at Charles Morris, who actually had the right philosophy, which was a pragmatist philosophy, which is non-realist and non-referentialist, and where Morris's pragmatic aspects of symbols refer to the relation of symbols to system goals. So there's a way of doing percept action loops and semiotics that's more coherent if you start from a better semiotics.
Tom Short's version of Peirce, and his analysis is very good and very thorough, shows the extent to which final causality is very much part of the later semiotics. And Peirce had several different versions of his theory. And the mature semiotic, as Short argues, was fully teleological. So I do, but your point is well taken. Peirce is also, trying, he's trying to go toward realism and toward truth, and one could get infinitely closer and never arrive. So yes, but I am trying to correct some of the problems with particularly the earlier versions of Peirce's theory. The area I work in, biosemiotics, we all use Peirce. So if you go back to Charles Boris, and some of us do, but that it's just, you know, a matter of that's the convention that I'm trying to bring in the self-reference to the teleology. And I think it works better.
I would say just try to free your mind of any of these systems and try to come up with a new framework on your own, rather than trying to shoehorn Peirce into some other set of relations.
Well, maybe I did, and I'm just justifying it by saying it's
Touche.
This also comes from my, where I didn't bring it up, but I came to this type of sign, not through biosemiotics necessarily, but through emergence theory and theories of intentionality, where the object, you have a holistic emergent whole that is not a physical thing, and yet it constrains the actions of the parts. And that sounds more like the objective, which are the biases of a system that constrain a system. So this type of sign model can be taken to emergence theory and used there, and it also resonates well with intentionality, even though those theories were specifically for mentalism and not for cognitive systems.
Can you name a book from emergence theory that you recommend?
Well, my favorite writer for emergence theory is Jeffrey Goldstein, who has several papers. Where'd that come? Oh, yeah, Jeffrey Goldstein. He's at Adelphi University. Yeah, just Google his name with emergence. There's lots of papers. He's writing a 1,200-page book.
Well, that's a lot of books. What I'm seeing in your formulation, let's say, if not a theory per se, perhaps it's going to evolve, but I've seen an addition, which is the idea, at least the idea, if not the real narrative in your theory of semiotics, where before that, neither Saussure nor Peirce nor Hanslieb has that kind of thing. Like, you don't just operate with the idea of sign and signification, but also a causality of the situation. I mean, you have the narrative all around your presentation as well as your book.
Do you mean by narrative here, the deer fleas?
Not just that. That is a very evident part of it. But maybe, I mean, I'm not sure if you're doing it on purpose or liminally. I don't know. But do you know it? I mean, this is a question. Do you consider narrative in your theory? Because if you do, I mean, that is a big addition. Huh?
I started out as a narrative theorist, and that's
Okay.
related to teleology. I'm not the only one. In biosemiotics, we assume that semiosis is more or less coextensive with life and with purposeful action. So, you know, semiosis is not just about the actions, signs like symbols, our type of semiosis, but it's coextensive with life.
Well, you're talking about biosemiotics, right?
Yeah, but my version of what is a sign is supposed to be applicable to signs at other levels of human semiosis. I think of human thought as biological representations of biological representations. So these, and since you don't have the kind of reality check with abstractions, mental abstractions that you have with self-signaling, then the self-affirmation can get way out of hand and disconnected from reality. But it's still self-affirming, and if and we see this in populations where people if you surround yourself with enough people that think like you do, that will affirm your ideas about the world. And Google, when you're searching, those are the kinds of things that you like to find, and they show you. So our intelligence is on a downward spiral now with these algorithms.
A very ill-formed thought. I have always been a little uncomfortable with semiotics, and what I see here now kind of ties into one of the things in your talk. This particular page, I see this on, about habits, and I'm thinking of the habit of the syntax of language as that we share in our thinking, because what you're showing here is that it is the gear flees at the noise that has created this. The way we have thought in language has led us to create the symbolic system of how it is all connected. And it is very difficult to jump out of that linguistic habit of how we think, which is then certainly will resonate with between disciplines, because we're all living in language, and even between languages, but some languages are more distant than others from this.
Yeah, if I were to unpack the language there, the response would, I'd have to tell you how a physical response actually occurs in an intelligent system. It's not.
In other words, I see that the theory itself is grounded in our way of thinking, which is grounded in how we have learned language.
And we are a biological system. So, I mean, one of Kirsten's insights, I think, are we can understand, we're not projecting ourselves on the biological world, we are biological. And so I would rather sort of deconstruct our notions of intentionality rather than get all excited about projecting your intentionality on non-intelligent forms. We're not as, our intelligence is a process similar to these kinds of intelligence on a higher, more complex level.
Okay. Thank you, Tori. All right. I will just.
That is something to say. You do say that you're pleased at the moment. And it's what you say. In such, in body sort of.
Thank you, Lou. All right. This is, I've happily attended the Heinz von Förster meeting in 2011, and some folks have seen a project I'm doing called Systems Countercultures, which is kind of historical on the line of Jamie's work. This is from this sort of other more kind of straightforward literature and science scholarship. And so I'm going to actually, I'm just going to read you a piece of my forthcoming book. Thank God it's still forthcoming. So this is unpublished work. But this is just kind of my effort to think narrative theory against systems theory, neo-cybernetics being a phrasing that Luhmann used as a general synonym for second-order cybernetics. So that's the systems theory I'm mainly engaged with, along the line of autopoietic theory from Matron and Varela to Luhmann's appropriation of it. Okay, so let me just talk about the telepathic imaginary. So we're starting to just to wrap our heads around this phenomenon of the idea of telepathy. And the telepathic imaginary is alive and well in the fictional universe in both obvious and subliminal forms. Telepathy comes forward as both as a highly popular conceit, as content and common event in fantastic and science fictional story worlds, and also, after the work of Nicholas Royle, a British literary critic, as a formal characteristic of so-called realistic narratives, as I'll explain. And following Royle's lead, I'll offer some of my own narratological notes on telepathy on the way to venturing a systems theoretical reading and decoding of the telepathic imaginary. I'm going to use this diagram of systems differentiations that I introduced in my last book, Post-Human Metamorphosis, and which actually I retread, and it shows up again in this forthcoming book. So, over and above the psychic systems at play, the communication of telepathic messages from mind to mind, were that to occur, would constitute a social system as well. The telepathic imaginary posits supernaturally transmissive or receptive minds and also a sort of phantom sociality. Very much like narrative itself, but without narrative's structural contingencies or fictive license, the notion of telepathy superimposes the distinct operations of psychic and social systems, superimposes their differential operationality. And both narrative theory and systems theory now have the tools, however, to disambiguate and so expose the workings of these veiled transfers between the psychic and the social. Now, moreover, so let me give you an example from cinematic narrative. The angelic cinematic fantasy Wings of Desire reminds us that the telepathic imaginary is a relatively modern humanization of capacities formerly possessed by the supernatural intercessors of classical and Christian theology. It's just the opening couple of seconds of that. So the film's opening sequence shows an eye, and then the view, its view of the sky over Berlin, this supernal view at once the angels and the films, suggests that this cinematic narration is itself located beyond the world of its story. For unlike adult and time-bound humanity, like a timeless child, and you may recall that only very young children can see the angels, but anyone older than a quite small child, they're completely invisible and outside their world. But like a timeless child, the cinematic eye can also see the angels, such as Dactyl here on his eyrie or eyrie overlooking the city. And soon after, either the angel or the agency that narrates it, the cinematic agency, flies past a Berlin radio tower and receives its transmission simultaneously on all frequencies. So these sound and film images update the supernatural or divine messenger, the angel, as a precursor of invisible and seemingly immaterial radio and television broadcasts, as a modern incarnation of angelic mediation, telepathy now concerns matters of transmission and perception modeled on concurrent forms of media technology. You'll recall the word was invented in 1882 by Myers, the British classicist, and so it's concurrent with the very sort of emergence of modern communications technology. So telepathy, what is it? It is mind transmission from a psychic sender or mind reading on the part of a psychic eavesdropper. For instance, as the angel Dactyl invisibly ministers to a flock of lost souls on the subway, and I've got this wonderful clip. Hopefully you recall it from the movie, but it's a QuickTime clip and it doesn't play on this machine. But in any event, this is basically what happens in the clip. The angel Dactyl invisibly ministers to a flock of lost souls on the subway, and as he's walking down the aisle of the subway, the movie renders his telepathic reception through the voiceover narration of their overheard thoughts. So we hear what the angel hears in their voices as the angel is tuning into their unspoken thoughts. And then finally, visible to us, the angel transmits a moment of spiritual relief to the mind of a tormented passenger. So Nicholas Royle, the critic I mentioned earlier, notes that telepathy is historically linked to numerous other telephenomena. It is part of the establishment of teleculture in general. It is necessarily related to other 19th century forms of communication at a distance through new and often invisible channels, including the railway, telegraphy, photography, the telephone, and gramophone. So let's add one other channel to this larger history of the modes of mediation and communication, one that Royle's literary account takes for granted, to simply the modern novel. In book form, the novel, of course, does not communicate from a distance, but it too is a media technology for which, at the semiotic level, the signal transmitter is the narrator encoded into the text as encoding its discourse. And broadly speaking, relative to the first person or character-bound narrator of much traditional storytelling, even before the era of teleculture, the third person or authorial or omniscient narrator of so-called realistic prose fiction has been taking some strange liberties. And Royle describes these like so. There is uncanny knowledge. Someone is telling us what someone else is thinking, feeling, or perceiving. That someone else may not even be aware of experiencing these thoughts, feelings, or perceptions. The history of criticism of the novel is the history of the attempt to deal or avoid dealing with this seemingly mad scenario. So let's briefly assess the telepathy connection in relation to prose fiction's primary narrative forms. So here's a quick narrative theory primer. On the one hand, and I'm using the terminology of the German narrative theorist Fritz Stanzel, which is character-bound, authorial, and figurative. You may be familiar with first person, third person, and often free and direct discourse is another name for figural narration. So, first of all, one delineates the character-bound narrator. And under the conventions of literary realism, a character-bound narrator marks the self-depiction of a normal person, one having access only to its own knowledge and thoughts, narrating from within the story world that it constructs for the reader as it narrates. About other characters, it knows only what it can observe from its own vantage and standard sensory channels. So if the story is realistic, then, in scare quotes, if it's a realistic narrative, then in whatever manner it proceeds, the reader will expect no uncanny knowledge from a character-bound narrator. But on the other hand, matters are altogether different with the authorial narrative. As with the cinematic narration of Wings of Desire, the authorial or third-person narrator or prose fiction operates over and above its story world, almost angelically, you could say, and is licensed by realistic narrative convention to have potentially unrestricted access to the conscious and unconscious minds of the characters about which it narrates. The Royal rightly insists that the authorial narrator is not so much omniscient, but virtually telepathic. And I would add that cinematic narration has techniques that easily approximate the virtual telepathy of authorial narration in literature. And for instance, in Wings of Desire's subway scene, which I just described, the direct voiceover rendering of character thought shows the authorial form not just of the angel's telepathic reception, but also of the cinematic discourse as such. And additionally, the virtual telepathy available to the authorial narrator is compounded in an important variant of modern narrative techniques, free and direct discourse, which Stanzel terms the figural narrative situation. Here, a covert authorial narrator, so that's the idea, we still got an authorial narrator, but now they're not overtly rendering the text, but they've kind of bracketed themselves. A covert authorial narrator renders an account from within the character's mind, that is, from the perceptual point of view that the character occupies within the story world, and additionally renders it in the idiom of speech that the character would use were it narrating itself. So the figural narrative situation straddles the border of the story world. It suspends or sublates that border by operating on both sides of it at once. It's a two-sided narrative form, to go back to that coin. So in figural narration, the authorial narrator focalizes or perceives from within the story world through the character, whereas in strict authorial narration, the narrator focalizes or perceives the story world as if from above, from its own orbit beyond the story world. So what we see from this is that realism in narrative, realism, quote unquote, in narrative strictly applies not to narratives, but only to the depiction of characters and to the matter of their adherence to normal epistemological limitations. Otherwise, even realistic narratives depend on narrators or narrations that stage what in actual persons would be paranormal or telepathic capacities. When a narrative presents characters that are them, and then, now if we switch to non-realistic narratives or to fantasy or science fictional narratives, a narrative that presents characters that are themselves paranormal, angelic, like Damiel, or psychic, that narrative is in fact hiding in plain sight a piece of its own fictive machinery. Or put it another way, a story that presents literally telepathic characters is manifesting a particular form of narrative self-reference. Like a story within a story, it's a case of a technique within a technique. So as approached in the narrative dimension, the literal depiction of telepathy is an allegory of the conditions of authorial narration. At the level of narrative construction, all that the fictive depiction of telepathy need involve is the transposition of an authorial narrator's telepathic privilege to a character's capacity. Now, let me give you an example. We can see this collusion between telepathic and narrative capacity in an early work of the late African-American author Octavia Butler in her novel Mind of My Mind. This novel relocates the story of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, let me just sketch the novel quickly for you. You'll recall Dracula is a telepathy novel, all kinds of psychic weirdness going on. The psychic relationship there between Count Dracula and Mina Harker returns in that between Butler's character Doro, basically the Dracula character, and Mary is the Mina character. As Mind of My Mind proceeds in sections titled by characters' names, the telling of this fiction alternates between authorial and character-bound narrations. Like Count Dracula in Bram Stoker's novel, Doro never directly narrates. But Butler's authorial narrator does have selective access to Doro's thoughts, and we hear them from the authorial narrator looking down at Doro. Now, of all the characters, only Mary narrates, our main protagonist, but not all the time. But when she does not, the authorial narrator returns to carry the story along. So this alternation of narrative situations between character-bound and authorial, or first and third person, works nicely in this novel to foreground textual and discursive dynamics in the midst of the telepathic story events. Now, Doro is not telepathic. Doro is not a telepath. His main power is sending his mind serially, one after the other, and irreversibly out of his current body and into a new body. But he supplements his lack of telepathy by breeding telepaths. Okay. All right. All of Doro's children over millennia, it's a breeding campaign that Doro's been carrying out. Anyways, all of Doro's children are born with some variation of psychic power over which they have no control until they pass successfully through transition, as it's named in the book. As the story opens, Mary is a telepath prior to transition. She receives random psychic outbursts, typically from a nearby person in some situation of extreme terror, which she can't turn off, but must endure until they fade out. So she relates how, I was close to my change, my transition, when somebody screamed bloody murder inside my head. I was picking up shadows of crazy emotions. Eventually, however, once she passes through her transition, that ordeal restores her psychic autonomy with the emergence of a boundary around her telepathic mind, and with that, the possibility of self-control and effective social participation. Practicing her new post-transition telepathic skills, Mary narrates from within, in the first moments of its formation, her acquisition of a shield. All right. And it's this passage I want to use to segue now to the system's theoretical consideration of the operational differentiation that needs to be made between psychic and social systems. So, and I think this is a kind of almost, it's readable as an allegory of that necessity. So this is Mary, character-bound, narrating her experience as her transition takes. Talking about the shield that's forming around her mind. I examined it curiously. It was a mental wall, a mental globe with me inside. I wondered how I was supposed to open it. As I wondered, it began to disintegrate. It surprised me, scared me. I wanted it back, and it was back. Well, that wasn't hard to understand. The shield kept me secure as long as I wanted it to, and there were degrees of security. I began the disintegration process again, felt the shield grow thinner. I let it become a kind of screen, something I could receive other people's thoughts through. I experimented until I could hold it just heavy enough to keep out the kind of mental noise I had been picking up before and during my transition. It kept out the noise, but it didn't keep me in. So I'm going to read Butler's novel now for its foregrounding of telepathy's phantom sociality. Framed by social systems theory, this novel suggests that the precondition for a mind's participation in communication is its own operational autonomy, or its closure, right? Its operational closure or organizational closure. The conflation or mingling of psychic systems and telepathic relations arises, the idea of this mingling or possible transgression of psychic borders arises from a supposed usurpation of communicative functions by psychic functions. The telepathic imaginary constructs a social system between minds and then occults it through an unbinding of psychic boundaries. So in this way, telepathy is a swallowing up of the social by the psychic. Its power as an imaginary structure is bound up with the desire for the pleasure of canceling the epistemological closure of the psyche, canceling or transgressing or controlling in some way, but opening up what is necessarily closed. And yet, in order to function viably as a telepath within society, Mary's transition must restore what her nascent superpower initially overrides. Her acquisition of a shield presents a narrative figure for what any normal person already has and can never lose without mental derangement: the operational boundaries of a psychic system capable of selecting from and thereby reducing the overwhelming complexity of its environment. So we're already reading telepathy through neo-cybernetics, or social systems theory, and we now arrive at the key concepts in my estimation for this approach, and this will be the final movement of this talk. So the first of these concepts is the operational closure of an autopoietic or self-referential system. The notion of telepathy violates autopoietic closure. That's just flat out. But the case is that minds alone cannot communicate. Instead, the autopoietic operation of human psychic and social systems, and this is the second key concept, interpenetrate. So Luhmann's account of the systemic dynamic, I think, is the most germane and precise text for unraveling the muddle of telepathy. So in the chapter Interpenetration in Social Systems, Luhmann defines this concept of interpenetration of the psychic and the social system as an inter-system relation between systems that are environments for each other. Both systems enable each other by introducing their own already constituted complexity into each other. And they do so without compromising each other's closure or autonomy. But how is this possible? How can system boundaries interpenetrate without violating or breaking into each other? So the answer Luhmann gives rests on several technical premises of his theory. And this diagram is essentially Luhmannian in inspiration. So first of all, psychic and social systems are not living but metabiotic, not biological autopoietic, but metabiological, or what I term metabiotic autopoietic systems. Their boundaries are not material, but virtual. Both psychic and social systems form operational boundaries by processing system-internal, system-environment distinctions. At the same time, despite this level of formal and operational conformity, the particular autopoietic elements of psychic systems, moments of consciousness, differ entirely from the particular autopoietic elements of social systems, events of communication. The kinds of distinctions processed respectively by psychic and social systems are distinct from each other, even while they share the same form of boundedness and a common medium of meanings, as these are carried by the media, environments, signs for instance, in which both kinds of systems are mutually and always already embedded. So for the interpenetration of psychic and social systems then, and here's a big chunk of Luhmann, let me just take you quickly through it. Decisively, the boundaries of one system can be included in the operational domain of the other. Thus, the boundaries of social systems fall within the consciousnesses of psychic systems. Consciousness intervenes and thereby acquires the possibility of drawing boundaries for social systems precisely because these boundaries are not at the same time boundaries of consciousness. The same holds conversely. The boundaries of psychic systems fall within the communicative domain of social systems. Communication is constantly forced to use what psychic systems have already assimilated in their consciousnesses and what they have not. This is possible because the boundaries of psychic systems are not also boundaries of communicative possibilities. Every system that participates in interpenetration realizes the other system within itself as the other system's difference between system and environment without destroying its own system-environment difference. So, as meaning systems processing different or distinct forms of distinction, that is, processing different differences, the boundaries of psychic and social systems are not materially attached to the internal processes that they bind. This allows such boundaries to interpenetrate with the reciprocal systems in their environments without an accompanying penetration of system processes. These boundaries are the respective virtual surfaces where differential system-environment distinctions are put into play and renegotiated from moment to moment. To that extent, the environmental outside of one boundary is available to the systemic inside of the reciprocal system, and the reciprocity of minds and societies in the interpenetration of psychic and social systems then could be figured as the reciprocal, if you will, phantom telepathy by which the ever-renewed impressions of meanings bind consciousnesses to communications even while maintaining their respective systemic closures. Finally then, viewed from here, from this sort of point of systems theoretical conceptuality, the notions of telepathy or mind reading or thought projection have always been a sort of systemic Saturnalia, a topsy-turvy, inside-out version of reality, right? But by observing the ways that these perennial narrative tropes turn the internal operations of autopoietic systems inside out, we can flip the picture right side out again and so reconfirm closure with interpenetration as the ultimate contingency for the systemic continuation of meaning systems, psychic and social systems. Telepathy, so observed, telepathy inverts and remediates the complex topology of structural couplings by which psychic and social systems interpenetrate without operational muddle. And both the realistic and the fantastic telling of telepathy condenses in a narrative figure the way that the discursive transmission of all narrative structures is bound to superimpose depictions of consciousness and events of communication. So for a neo-cybernetic critic, parsing these systems' distinctions is the task. For a neo-cybernetic critic, parsing systems distinctions, then, the task is to tease the systems apart once again. All right, thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah, Lou.
I think it's very interesting that in the narrative forms in which telepathy occurs, the first step is the lifting of any postulation of mechanism by which it occurs. So that in that sense it is coincident with a systems theorist point of view that says, well, you don't need to think about a signal going from one place to the other. You can think of it structurally. Only here the structure is not given, and then you're in the fiction or the fantasy or the story that is coming. And it's also the first step when people learn to do something that they deem to be telepathy, to lift that notion.
If there were a mechanism that wouldn't be telepathy.
I'm sorry.
That's what makes it telepathy.
Well, I mean, I think of the fictive affordance is always a lift. It is a lifting of a limitation.
Yeah.
A lift, and certainly in the fictive occasion, there's no need. Well, I mean, it kind of this novel that I reference here is it's more fantasy than science fiction. Often the science fictional narrative will noodle around with, some rationale. There's always the good old luminiferous ether, after all, to carry the mind waves on the straight transmission.
Well, the beaming up and down. Right?
Yeah.
So, but what about texting? How does texting relate? Texting.
Texting?
Yes. In texting, you're at a distance and you're sending ideas, but it's not telepathy because you know how it's being done.
No, it's
right?
it's just.
But could it be that telepathy is something that we might discover how it's functioning at some point later, like non-local quantum phenomena?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm skeptical about the facticity of telepathy, but I can't rule it. I mean, I've never had a telepathic experience, but I have friends who think they have. I don't know what to say. I'm not inside their minds, so I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I think, but I just think texting, when you get right down to it, it's just a straight out media technology that's doing the basic, for which maybe the bridge rules that Peter was talking. I mean, in other words, you get, I mean, there's a step at which the consciousness that has an intention to communicate has to translate that into a medium that is transmissible and receivable, and so you pray, as our person earlier said, or however you do it, by speaking or writing, but you get the thought out in a mode that is not a mode of consciousness. It's the event of communication is then the mediatic transmission, but that's not, and then that's converted back into consciousness on the receiver. Yeah, Peter.
Not to necessarily change the subject from telepathy, but some of us were looking at your very interesting paper in Distributed Foundations on the systems counterculture and von Forster, And that seems very apropos to the cybernetics of cybernetics. And I was just wondering if you might give some comments about the cybernetics of cybernetics in the context of your take on von Forster and the counterculture of the 60s.
It is kind of changing the topic, but
but it's linking to the first talk. That's why it seemed apropos to me, at least. But it's all right. We can think about telepathy instead.
No, I don't mind passing on beyond. I just need to readjust my my thought waves here.
I was just looking at your paper, and I never really, it should have registered, but it never really registered how sort of 60 counterculture-ish second-order cybernetics sort of is.
Right.
And
yeah.
And I have different feelings about that. In some ways, it's very visionary, and there are a lot of things about the counterculture that I like.
Yeah.
You might think that it's flaky, but I don't think conversation theory or any of the things that the BCL was developing are flaky. I think that we've been far, far ahead of where we are now had those things been funded and those
actually,
pursued.
Peter, I think I get the closest to a direct connection in some work I've been doing recently on John Lilly, which just foregrounds the psychedelic occasion all over the place. Once Lilly takes that major turn, but it was prompted by there's a slim file of correspondence between Lilly and Heinz in the Illinois archive, and it just got me really curious. And it's hard to, but what we can tell from that is Lilly came there at least once and spoke to the people at the BCL. And then if you look at Lilly's work throughout the 70s, Heinz is referenced multiple times as a vestige of, he considered Heinz mainstream scientific validation for where he was, by which time Heinz was not being really considered that way by, I would say, by the mainstream establishment. But what that draws out is the just to go directly to the crunch here is that the mind on LSD needed accounting for, and I mean, and my friends who think they've had telepathic experiences, they were usually on psychedelic drugs when they thought they had a telepathic experience, and so I think it's, I don't know the case with Heinz personally, but I think it's fair to say that the students coming out for his heuristic seminars were seeking ways to grapple with their psychedelic experiences, and essentially the sort of developing discourse of I mean, so you really needed a discourse of operational closure. I mean, it's actually, those minds needed shields, let's put it that way. Needed a discourse for closing back up the psychedelic opening. And at the same time, they needed a discourse for understanding the sheer phenomenal productivity, just the surplus of phenomenal experience produced by psychotropic drug. So I think it's, of course, the whole university catalog was was disrespected because it had these these flat out, the central part of the entire whole university catalog was a whole section on drugs and how to take them, and which Heinz just allowed into the document. And then when he got called on the carpet, I mean, it seems clear to me that was a large part of what was going on there. So I think there was an ambience and a response on the part of Heinz's exploration of the new cognitive schemas that he was working out at the end of that part of his career, having passed beyond the information theoretical framework of the self-organizing systems work of his earlier career, that resonated with his sort of ministering, if you want to put it that way, the way he was ministering to those students right at that time.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, this is a hot question maybe, but I was wondering how, to what extent the subject of your paper, telepathy, whether you're regarding that as relatively literal, and to what extent you might be thinking of it as metaphoric. And there's some metaphoric sense in which any novel was awfully telepathic, especially sort of postmodernist ones and so on. And I also want to say that listening to your talk is thus far the closest experience that I've had in my life thus far of actually being bitten by a vampire.
Oh, the vampire named Lumon? Which is my hope and intention, of course.
Yes.
The immortal vampire.
Tori and I were talking about this last night as we're kind of rehearsing our talks for each other. I mean, that fiction generally is, we love it. Those who get bitten by the need for fiction, the need to dwell in narrative, is because it's the direct route to the feeling of being in other minds, to the vicarious experience of getting yourself out of your own head and into other minds. And it's just, and so it's the absolutely normal expectation, and I mean, it's why we go to it for, so we don't necessarily have to dwell on it, the mechanics of it, to go for the pleasure, right, that it affords us to just get out of, to be drawn into the world of the fiction and to dwell there. And then so right on the experiential side of the reader's desire for narrative is kind of, and that's what's going on in the narrative anyways, whether it's a fantasy or just, I mean, it's already, it's there already, and so you collude with the form the form is there to give you the fix you want for getting out of yourself for a while. And then whatever the story happens to be, enactments of that. So that's, I mean, in a way you could call that, I mean, I think that's a looping process, you might say, or an enactment of the self-referentiality of the reader's desire being reconstructed in the very form of the way narration works.
So the answer is yes.
I guess.
With that.
Yes, Klaus.
You made a very strange comment about a horrible perspective in the third person. Would you say that science writing is in that sense, authority. It's all in third person.
Yes. Well, it depends on the stance. I mean, a sophisticated science writer is going to be able to play with their stance, and so it's up to them whether they stand over and above the events and render a so-called objective account of whatever it is, of what the body, the content of the science or the doing of the science, or if they go down to the bench and become a participant observer. I mean, so all these, to me, I mean, I didn't really explicitly frame it this way, but narration is observation. In other words, just the discourse of observation in cybernetics and second order cybernetics is ready to go as a way of studying narrative operations, or what Stanzel calls the narrative situations. And if you'll actually, if I might invite you to take a look at my post-human metamorphosis, not only there I introduce Spencer Brownian notation into the distinctions between narrative situations. And I've got a form calculation for the figural narrative situation. I won't go into it. But if Spencer Brown is a form of observation theory, I mean, if that's what it's, one thing that's all about, then...
I think Spencer Brown is an action theorist. The act of distinguishing is not an observation.
Well, observation comes for the ride.
Well, it comes for the ride, but I think that is different from, for example, God's eye view of typical science writing,
right,
where no author is visible, and just the way it is.
Right, that would be your strict authorial situation. I mean, God's eye view is another way to say the omniscient narrator. So yes, I think traditional science writing aims for the traditional sort of empirical ideal of objectivity standing outside the phenomenon in order to control and encompass it. And so that stance is recreated in the narration. But it's just a rhetorical construction. Just as it is for the scientists as well.
I think this is far more than just a rhetorical construction, because that is where scientists live. And I mean, that's another relation.
Not that they have a choice in that. Well, they do have a choice, but
they don't have a choice once they are educated in their discipline. But now, one thing that puzzled me, and I'm not sure I have a good question for that, but everything you said is your reading of, for example, a novel or things. What about the relationship between author and the listener? I mean, you play the authority of a reader.
Yeah.
And I somehow feel uncomfortable with that. For example, that novel, which I've never heard of, must have readers, and they must get something out of it, which is probably not what you get out of it. So, what are we describing?
We're describing
the author?
We're describing the constructivist epistemology of the reader.
Well, who's the reader? I mean, you are not the reader. You are just a
literary
theorist or whatever. No? I mean, you are a specialist, and I don't think you represent the reader. If there is the reader, you know?
Okay, a reader. Me.
Yeah, that would be much better.
There's an implied reader.
Right.
There's a specific, a lot of books have a specific implied reader that you are addressing a particular client.
That's a danger, because then he talks about 4 other people who are not granted the voice.
Well,
yeah, that is...
I don't believe I claimed that I offered you the God's eye view on any of this.
Well, but you didn't talk about the reader. You have not interviewed any
No, I will have to suffice for the research question.
That is big.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.